Hello, thank you for joining us. My name's Ella. I'm part of the presenting team for Festival of Nature. Across the festival, you're looking at how we can work together to protect nature. When you think of nature, you're probably thinking of the nature you can see or hear. You might think of the birds outside your window or how your local park is an incredible habitat for local wildlife. You might think about marine ecosystems. You might think of us. We're nature. The world that we live in hasn't always been like this. Imagine 100 years ago, nature would look very different. Now imagine 200 million years ago. What would our world look like then? What would it feel like? These are questions that Jack Lovegrove from University of Bristol has been looking at. He'll be telling us more about his research throughout the conversation. I'd like to welcome Jack onto the screen.
Hello.
Hello, Jack. Firstly, could you tell us about your connection to University of Bristol?
Certainly. So I'm a fourth year paleontology and evolution student at the university.
Brilliant. All right, so we're going to be learning about your research today, aren't we? And it would be brilliant if you could firstly just start with telling us about your connection to dinosaurs. Where did it start? How did it start?
So I think, like most kids, I was given for Christmas one year a book about a dinosaur book, and that's where it started. And then through visiting museums, it just kind of grew from there until I came to decide what degree I wanted to do at uni. And I thought, why not go for it and do this?
I love that. I think that's so powerful that a book can inspire you and then guide you through your career to where you are now. Thank you.
Yeah.
So what is your research at the university on?
So alongside my undergraduate degree, I've done a summer research project, which was looking at reconstructing the landscape around Bristol and the surrounding area during the Rhaetian stage of the Triassic, which was 200 to 205 million years ago. And this is an important time in the Bristol area as we have lots of fossils of animals that lived at this time, including most famously the Bristol Dinosaur, Phaeodontosaurus, that if you've ever been to the Bristol Museum and Art Gallery, you'll have seen this fantastic model of.
I can remember having a look at that. Could you tell us more about this dinosaur? I'm going to try and say the name, Phaeodontosaurus?
Yeah, that's right, Phaeodontosaurus.
Yeah. Okay,
so,
tell us more.
Phaeodontosaurus is important for lots of reasons. It was only the fourth dinosaur ever described as a dinosaur. It is an early member of the lineage that led to the giant sauropods. So it used to be called a prosauropod, but more properly now it's called a sauropodomorph. And it's important also for Bristol, for the area, because the first fossils were found here. They were found in a quarry next to the Downs, and you can still go see the quarry face if you want. It's on a road called Quarry Steps, and you can just kind of look over and see it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I'll have to have a look. Okay, so this dinosaur, do you know how big they were? What kind of food they ate?
Yeah, so this is a part of the rationale behind my research is that Phaeodontosaurus is small, especially for a dinosaur. It's about the size of a big dog. So the length of the big ones, I reckon, was about 2 meters, which is odd because most of the other Rhaetian sauropodomorphs are bigger. They're beginning to become these giants that they later go on to become. And it's been suggested that the reason it might have been small was because it was an island dwarf. So animals that live on small islands shrink in size to cope with having a smaller amount of available resources. So that's kind of one of the ways my research comes in, is looking at reconstructing the size of the islands it lived on so we can test this theory that it was an island dwarf. And it's also, because obviously it's Bristol's dinosaur and we have lots and lots of fossils of it, there's lots of research going on about it at the university. And there was a recent paper came out that suggested it may have been more omnivorous rather than strictly herbivorous, which is what people usually think about it eating. So yeah.
That's really interesting. How do you realize that? How do you realize that perhaps it's omnivorous rather than?
So it was Solmaz's research, so I apologize if I get it a little bit wrong, but they were looking at its brain case and parts of its internal ear anatomy, and they found that it appears to be specialized for fast movement and agility, and I think tracking things with its head, which is something you'd expect to see in something that was maybe snacking on the odd little lizard-like creature, which there are lots of in the same rocks that we find Fico in.
Oh, I see. Okay, that's really interesting. And you spoke about island dwarfism. That's an interesting concept as well, because the Bristol that we know, there aren't islands.
Yeah.
So I'd be interested to hear more about that.
So this is getting to kind of the crux of my research, is that we also find marine rocks in the Bristol area from the Ratian. They're called the Westbury Formation. And so because we have both evidence of terrestrial rocks and evidence of marine rocks very close together, the logical conclusion is there were islands. And if there were islands, based on where we find Ficodontosaurus fossils, we would expect them to be formed of the folded Paleozoic rocks, which are older than the dinosaurs, which it takes a bit of getting your head around, but they were already old when Ficodontosaurus lived, and they'd already been folded and faulted. And you can still see these today, so probably the best place is, they're the rocks that make up the Avon Gorge. So when you're driving through the gorge or on the bridge and you see all these big slanted rock units, those made up the islands that Ficodontosaurus lived on. And because we still have them, and we think they haven't been majorly deformed since then, it's possible to build a surface over the top of them using borehole data and just the data of where they're exposed today and the heights, and then go to the marine rocks that I mentioned and build a surface of them, and basically seeing where the folded surface kind of pokes through the flatter marine surface is how we work. It's how I calculated where the islands were and their sizes. So
Wow.
there's kind of three main island areas. There's the Bristol one, which ran into what's now the Downs across the gorge, because the gorge is more recent. The gorge wasn't there at this point. Across the gorge and into Fayland. There's also the Mendips Island, which is interesting because we've got lots of fossils from it, but Ficodontosaurus doesn't seem to have been there, or not. There's only like one or two fossils of Fico from there, which is unusual because it's the biggest, so you'd expect there to be more. And also up around Tiverington, where there are still quarries quarrying into the sediment, fossils have been found from one of these islands.
Wow. It's understanding Bristol in a completely different way. When I'm walking through Bristol, I'm not thinking about this, but it really shows the incredible research that's being done. And that makes me wonder about how you're collecting data now compared to what it was like before. Are there big differences?
Yes. So one of the things about this project was that I didn't, although I have obviously been out into the field a lot around Bristol, for this project, I didn't need to go and measure loads and loads of rock sections. So this project, I took all of the historical data that people have been recording and writing up in papers, combined with borehole data that the BGS have stored, and used that combined with a modern GIS program, ArcGIS. And by fusing all these old measurements with the modern technology is how I was able to build these 3D models. And so, yeah, I just think that's quite cool, because these people have tried to do something similar in the past, but without computers, it's very difficult, because you kind of just have to make a best guess and trace around contours. And now with computers, we can take the data they were using and build this really nice 3D model. And there are some interesting stories because reading through all the historical stuff about how much things have changed. So there's one paper which is very useful that describes a section on the Great Western Main Line next to Temple Meads. And the guy who recorded it, as far as I could tell from the paper, literally just kind of turned up, found someone who looked like they worked for the railway, went, "Can I go look at the rocks?" And they were like, "Yeah, sure, just try not to get hit by a train." And then he just walked out and looked at them, which I don't think you could get away with that now.
Probably not. Don't think we should be doing that. So you said BGS, that's the
British Geological Survey. Sorry, yeah.
Okay,
so they have, whenever someone drills a borehole. So for example, they drilled a load of them when they were putting in the M4, building the M4, M5 motorways. So there's actually a sequence of localities in the marine unit that I mentioned, the Westbury, where people have reported fossils from, that when you look at them on a map, you're like, how are they finding fossils there? Because it's under a motorway, but that's from these boreholes that they dug as they were building the motorway to see what the rocks were like. So, yeah, and I got to collaborate with the BGS on this project.
Wow, it sounds like a big collaboration through time that's enabled you to be doing the work that you're doing now.
Yeah, so this is kind of building on lots and lots of research at its own. And now that we've got ArcGIS, and I'd learned how to use ArcGIS as part of my degree, so that we were able to do this.
I love that. Okay, so what is the broader relevance of this research?
So the ration is important for not just the Bristol area, but for the whole of the UK, and also for lots of parts of other Europe. So like the North, what's now the North Sea, and bits of Central Europe as well, because we see there's a dramatic change in environment. So before this, we have this area is like, it's sometimes called the Central European Basin, is like a desert basin. So I'm trying to think of the word, like an endorheic desert basin. So rather than water draining out to the sea, it's collecting in this basement and evaporating. So you get these thick sequences of desert rocks, which are distinctive because they're red, because in deserts, iron in the sediment oxidizes and you get a red color. And you can see this today at Cliff, which is next to one of the bridges to Wales. So people have probably driven past it and not realized. And then if you look at Cliff, you can see this big thick red unit that represents the desert. Then there's a thinner greeny grey unit, which represents the first marine waters coming in. And then there's a black unit, and that's the Westbury Formation, and that represents the basin flooding and you getting marine conditions, although it probably, it wasn't fully marine, it was like an inland sea. And this is when the islands appear. So mapping how the area flooded and proving that it had flooded by the ration and that there were still these islands is important more broadly, because it shows us more of what was happening at the flooding of the basin. And I'm not sure you could do it anywhere other than Bristol. There's some areas in South Wales you could maybe do it, because most other areas don't have this combination of the folded Paleozoic rock still there and the Mesozoic marine rock, the ration rock overlying it. So it's important for that reason. It's important because the animals that live on the island, so there's Phaeodontosaurus that lived on the islands, there's Phaeodontosaurus, but there's also some early mammal relatives, so our ancestors were there. And obviously understanding the environments they lived in is important for understanding aspects of early mammal evolution. So yeah, those are, I'd say, the two biggest drivers of understanding how the environment changed and understanding the environment, what the islands that Phaeodontosaurus and the animals that lived alongside it lived on. There's, I mentioned Cliff, and Cliff is a really good site that I'd recommend trying to go see if you want to kind of get a visual look at this, because you get this really distinct change in color that you don't need to have much or any knowledge of geology to be able to look at the cliff and be like, oh wow, it's gone from red to green and then to this really distinct black. So yeah.
Thank you. And I love that you're sharing about how we can get involved and begin to learn. Do you have any other tips for how we can get learning if we're just new to this?
So I would definitely recommend fossil hunting as a hobby. It's a great hobby to go out and do. You should look up some guides for where to do it. There's lots of website guides that will tell you how to do it. And it's just, I think it's a great, I don't want to say excuse, but it's a great reason to go out into nature, into places that you wouldn't necessarily go. So for example, there's Penarth is a good fossil hunting site around Bristol. Just it's near Cardiff, and you go there and it's this amazing beach with these amazing cliffs that you get to walk along, and you always see like seals and other seals and seabirds and stuff flying and swimming around. So it's a good reason to go out into nature, and you can find some cool stuff. So I would definitely recommend looking into kind of trying to go fossil hunting as a way to get into it, because that's another of the things that got me into it, was doing fossil hunting as a hobby. Yeah.
Thank you. I love that. I love the idea of being able to walk along a beach and to see nature existing in the contemporary world, and then also to be able to uncover and learn more about our shared history. It just feels like a really incredible opportunity to be able to do that. And I'm wondering about how learning about these incredible species that lived a long time ago before us, how does that link to modern wildlife conservation?
So I would say that paleontology as a whole is very important to wildlife conservation, because it's demonstrated to us how fragile our kind of unnatural world is, and how much things can change, and how easy it is for species to go extinct. So in particular, as I've talked about, this shows us how these extraordinary environmental transitions that, like, if you said to someone, oh, like, this desert is gonna, in a few million years, is gonna be completely underwater and studded with tropical islands, no one would believe you. But through studying these, we're able to show that that did happen. And I think when we're thinking about climate change and things like that, we need to bear in mind that nature isn't fixed, and like ecosystems and habitats aren't fixed things. They're constantly changing and evolving. And that just because it happens on timescales a lot of the time that we can't really see, but we need to be aware of it. And there's also, I think, a warning in this study that, although it wasn't, obviously it was nothing to do with anthropogenic climate change, it was to do with the opening of the Atlantic and rising sea levels. The animals on these islands, this incredible ecosystem that we have like the full cross section to the point where you could almost imagine being there if you read up on it. So there were lizards, things gliding through the trees. There were little early mammal relatives scurrying around the undergrowth. There were Phaeodontosaurus wandering around. It disappeared. It wasn't there for very long. And we see that in my study. So as well as doing the desert and the earliest flooding, I did a look at a later stage in the flooding at the top of a formation known as the Cotham. And you can see the islands begin to fragment, especially the one around Tiverington, and the one in Bristol gets split apart by the rising sea levels. And we see this in the Phaeodontosaurus. So it's been suggested that the ones at Tiverington, I think it's been suggested they may have gone extinct earlier because of this, because they were stuck on this low island that was breaking apart. So I think there's obviously a warning there about how fragile these things can be, and how much what we may think of as, oh, it's only a small amount of sea level rise, can be really threatening to animals that live on these small islands and are only found on these small islands. There's no evidence of Phaeodontosaurus on like the mainland at this time. It only appears to have lived on these islands.
So there's so much that we as humans can learn as well, by looking back into the past. And I'm hearing what you're saying about how fragile we are. And like you said, it is really challenging to imagine what the world could be like in the future when we don't see those huge changes in front of us, or at least not all of us do, especially over here. But it is a really important lesson for all of us, isn't it? So thank you for your incredible work. I want to ask, before we close this all up, if you have any recommendations for creative ways of engaging with dinosaurs, because you spoke at the start about that book that got you inspired in the first place. And if you have any films or podcasts or reading that you could share with us, that would be incredible.
I think I should plug here Reese, who's speaking next to my friends with, who's got a book out about fossil hunting in Bristol. Not in Bristol, in the whole of the UK. But I would also recommend Paleocast, which is a good podcast where they interview scientists about their research, paleontologists about their research. What else? There's lots of good blogs out there. So if we're talking about creative ways to get engaged, I would recommend Mark Whitten's blog, because he's a paleo artist. So I'm not an artist, but there's a lot of important work that paleo artists do for helping us to visualize and reconstruct the past. So like I mentioned the model in the Bristol Museum, the Phaeodontosaurus, that I think is a really, really good way of going and kind of getting into your head that like these were real animals that were walking around. So I would definitely recommend, yeah, blogs that talk about paleo art and thinking about reconstructing extinct species is a good, I think, creative way to get involved. And yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jack. Those are brilliant recommendations. And I do think you're an artist. The work that you're doing it's art because you're creating the visuals for it. You're mapping, you're communicating what happened before, and that is creative. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah,
and thank you for, thank you, everyone watching and listening at home as well for spending this time with us. You can find a lot more of the content online across the festival. Thank you for being with us.